The wall of the dead. What if I told you that Rome's greatest general, Julius Caesar, the man who pardoned his enemies, who was famed for his mercy once, ordered something so terrifying, so brutal, that it shocked even his own soldiers? A wall, not of stone, not of wood, but of corpses. This is the forgotten story of Caesar's final battle, where he nearly lost everything, and where mercy was consumed by vengeance. The shadow of civil war, the year, was 45 BC, and Rome was weary of war. For nearly 2 decades, the Republic had been torn apart by ambition, betrayal, and civil strife. Caesar, now dictator of Rome, had already crushed his rivals in Gaul, defeated Pompey at Pharsalus, and routed the remnants of opposition in Africa. He was at the height of his power, the master of the known world, but shadows lingered. In Hispano-modern Spain, the sons of Pompeius, Gnaeus, and Sextus Pompeius had not surrendered. With them was a man who once marched proudly at Caesar's side, Titus Labienus, his most trusted lieutenant in Gaul, now turned bitter enemy. Together, they raised an army of more than 70,000 men. Veterans, defectors, local tribes all rallied to the Pompeian banner. Their message was simple. Caesar was not a savior. He was a tyrant, and Rome must be freed from his grasp. Caesar could not ignore this threat. If Hispania fell, the Republic might rise again against him. So, gathering 4 of his toughest legions, including the legendary 10th Legion, Caesar marched west. The campaign was brutal. In the towns of Iulia and Attagua, Caesar's forces fought siege battles, using fire, deception, and relentless pressure. Pompeian commanders answered with ambushes and guerrilla tactics, grinding down the invincible general. For months, the land of Hispania burned. Finally, the 2 armies met at a place called Munda. The Pompeians held the high ground on advantage that should have guaranteed victory. Caesar's troops, though hardened, would have to fight uphill against a larger enemy. On the morning of March 17, 45 BC, the horns sounded. The fields of Munda shook as tens of thousands of soldiers prepared to decide the fate of Rome. At first, Caesar's men struggled. The uphill charge was grueling, the Pompeian lines unyielding. For the first time in years, Caesar's legions faltered. And then, Caesar did something few generals ever dared. He stepped down from his horse. He seized a shield, and he marched to the very front of the line. Lifting his voice so all could hear, he declared, "If we fall today, then Caesar falls with you. Let this day be the last for me or the first of our triumph." The effect was electric. The men who had marched with Caesar through Gaul, who had crossed the Rubicon with him, now surged with fury. The lines pushed forward once more, and the battle of Munda erupted in full fury. The turning point, the battlefield of Munda, was chaos. Tens of thousands clashed in the dust and heat of Spain. Caesar's men pressed uphill, shields rattling, swords striking. But the Pompey line was firm, unmoving, like a wall of iron. At first, the assault faltered. The incline drained the legionaries' strength. Spears rained down from above. Arrows darkened the sky. For the first time in years, the veterans of Gaul hesitated. They looked at the hill, at the countless enemy ranks, and some began to wonder, could even Caesar win here? But Caesar was no ordinary commander. He stood in a front line, shield in hand, dust staining his cloak, sweat streaking his face. He was 60 years old, but in that moment, he was the youngest and fiercest soldier of them all. He raised his voice above the clash of steel. Today, we fight not for Rome's crown, but for Rome's survival. Hold the line, push forward, your general fights beside you. The words burned through the ranks. The soldiers of the 10th Legion, Caesar's most loyal veterans, roared in response. These were the men who had crossed the Rubicon with him, who had bled at Pharsalus and Thapsus. To them, Caesar was not just a commander, he was destiny itself. The surge of the 10th. With a deafening cry, the 10th Legion advanced. Their pila spears cut through the Pompeian front. Their shields slammed into enemies. Their swords carved a path. Inch by inch, the line began to move. What had seemed like an immovable wall now bent under the fury of veterans who refused to die. On the other side, panic stirred. Gnaeus Pompeius, desperate to hold the high ground, shifted troops from his flanks to reinforce the center. It was a fatal mistake. For at that very moment, Caesar's cavalry, led by King Bogid of Mauritania, swept around the exposed side. Hooves thundered, dust billowed, and the Pompeian flank erupted in chaos. Caught between the hammer of Caesar's 10th and the anvil of Bogud's cavalry, the Pompeian line wavered. The death of Labienus amid the clash. Titus Labienus, once Caesar's right hand in Gaul, now his bitter enemy, tried to rally the troops. He charged into the melee, shouting, cursing, striking down soldiers with desperate fury. But fate had marked him. Surrounded, Labienus fell beneath Roman swords, his body trampled into the dust of the battlefield he had chosen. His death sent a shiver through Pompey's men. The general who had once defied Caesar was gone, and with him their hope began to collapse. The crumbling of Pompey's sons, Gnaeus Pompeius, in a final act of defiance, tried to regroup his men, but the tide was unstoppable. His lines buckled. His soldiers threw down their arms and fled. What had begun as a proud army of 70,000 dissolved into a panicked mob, trampled by their own retreat. By the day's end, nearly 30,000 Pompeians lay dead. The ground of Munda ran thick with blood. The wall of corpses, the sun set on Munda, and the battlefield was silent, but for the cries of the dying. 30,000 Pompeian soldiers lay scattered across the plain. Their bodies carpeted the earth. Their blood ran in dark rivers through the Spanish soil. For Caesar, it was a victory, perhaps his greatest and his most dangerous. But triumph was not enough. For years, Caesar had been known as a man of mercy. He had pardoned enemies, forgiven rivals, even embraced men who once sought his life. His clemency had been his strength, winning loyalty where fear could not. But on that day, at Munda, mercy died. Caesar stood among the carnage, dust and sweat clinging to his face. His eyes, once warm with charisma, were now cold steel. He gave an order that would burn itself into legend. Build me a wall, not of stone, not of timber, but of flesh. The order carried out, the legionaries hesitated. They had seen slaughter before, but never this. Yet Caesar's command was law. And so, with grim obedience, the soldiers began their work. They dragged the bodies of Pompeian soldiers, friends, neighbors, Romans, into heaps. They stacked them one upon another, forming a grotesque barricade that stretched around the field. Arms dangled, heads rolled, shields still clutched in lifeless fingers. The stench of blood filled the air as crows circled overhead. To complete the horror, Caesar commanded that the severed heads of Pompeian officers be placed on pikes. Leering down at the survivors, it was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard fortress. The message of terror. Why did Caesar do it? Perhaps it was rage at having nearly lost. Perhaps it was a warning to any who still dreamed of resisting him. Or perhaps, for once, even the great Julius Caesar could not escape the darkness of war. Whatever the reason, the message was clear. Resistance was death. Not just death, but humiliation, obliteration, erasure. Word of the wall of corpses spread across Hispania like wildfire. Cities surrendered without a fight, terrified of Caesar's wrath. A Pompeian stronghold opened its gates only to face another massacre, 42,000 slaughtered as an example to the rest. The fate of Pompey's son Sextus, Pompeius managed to flee, vanishing into the hills. But Gnaeus Pompeius was less fortunate. Caesar's men hunted him down, dragged him into the light, and cut off his head. The last of Pompey's heirs was silenced, his legacy extinguished. Caesar's reflection later, Caesar himself admitted, "At Pharsalus, I fought for victory. At Munda, I fought for my life." It was true. At Munda, the great general came closer to defeat than ever before. And in that brush with death, something inside him hardened. The clemency of the past gave way to a cruelty Rome had never seen in him before. The legacy of Munda, the fields of Munda, were silent now. The cries of the wounded faded, replaced by the cawing of crows and the crackle of torches burning among the dead. Caesar had won, yet victory did not bring him peace, brought him infamy. For all his brilliance, for all his genius, Caesar was no longer remembered only as a general of mercy. The wall of corpses had stained his name with a darkness Rome had never seen before. He had crushed Pompey's heirs, annihilated their legions, and turned their bodies into a monument of terror. The last civil war with Munda, the civil wars that had plagued Rome for decades, were finally over. There was no rival left standing. Caesar was now the undisputed master of Rome, a man whose word outweighed the Senate, whose legions had no equal. The Republic, though still alive in name, was dead in spirit. And yet victory brought unease. Among the Senate, whispers grew louder. If Caesar could order such horrors abroad, what would he do in Rome? If he could pardon enemies one day and massacre them the next, was he not already more than a man? Was he not a king? The shadow of assassination in the weeks after Munda, Caesar returned to Rome in triumph. The people cheered, the legions hailed him, and honors rained down upon him. But behind the applause lurked daggers. Senators watched with fear and resentment as Caesar accepted crowns, statues, and even divine titles. Among them, men like Brutus and Cassius remembered the wall of corpses. They saw in it not just cruelty, but the warning of what Rome would become if one man held unchecked power. And so, even as Caesar basked in his final victory, the plot against him was already taking shape. The Ides of March drew near, the birth of an heir. But Munda did more than seal Caesar's fate. It lit the path for his heir. With him on that campaign was a young man, little more than 19 years old, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew. He watched, he learned, he absorbed the lessons of blood and power. When Caesar fell, it would be Octavian who rose from the ashes. The boy who saw the wall of corpses would one day become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The eternal lesson, and so Munda stands in history as more than a battle. It was the end of the Republic's last hope. The moment Caesar's clemency gave way to brutality, and the shadow that foreshadowed his own downfall. Caesar himself admitted it. At Pharsalus, I fought for victory. Munda, I fought for my life. And in fighting for his life, he won an empire, but lost the Republic and perhaps even his own soul. Perhaps no victory reveals more about Julius Caesar than Munda. It was not the triumph of strategy alone, nor the glory of conquest. It was the raw struggle of survival. And survival demanded a price. 30,000 men lay dead, their bodies piled into a wall of warning. The conqueror of Gaul, the pardoner of Pompey's allies, had become the architect of terror. Munda was Caesar's last battle. It gave him Rome, but it also sealed his fate. For the Senate saw not just a general, but a king in all but name. And within a year, the daggers of Brutus and Cassius would strike him down on the Ides of March. Yet, even in death, Caesar's legacy did not vanish. From the ashes of Munda rose a young Octavian who would transform Rome into an empire. The Republic died in Spain, but from its grave emerged the eternal shadow of Caesar, echoing in the word emperor for centuries to come. If this story of Caesar's last battle revealed something new to you, don't let it fade into silence. Hit like to honor the memory of history. Share this tale with those who crave the hidden truths of the past. And subscribe to Empire Unveiled, legends where the myths of Rome, the betrayals of kings, and the forgotten battles of empires are brought back to life. Because history is not just remembered here, it is unveiled.